December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Japan is composed of an ancient, independent, proud people that is reflected in their culture and their politics. The government of this tiny island long ago adopted expansionistic policies designed to increase their country's resources and their geographic and political influence. These intentions led to their own imperialism in Asia and the Pacific, and ultimately to their attack on Pearl Harbor. In a surprise move, Japan attacks the Russian fortress Port Arthur, located on the coast of Manchuria. Russia built Port Arthur in 1887 to house the Russian Pacific Fleet. With the Yellow Sea to the east and the Bohai Sea to the west, Port Arthur commanded all approaches to China's ancient capital of Peking, and it protected Russian interest in the region, particularly Russia's claim to the mineral riches of Manchuria. This aggression was a threat to Japan and her claims to China. In 1905, the United States had a large interest herself in the Pacific, and therefore a considerable amount at stake in the outcome of the Japanese-Russian War. Through the entire war, Japan maintained the upper hand, but Russia would not stop fighting. Running out of capital to continue the fighting, Japan asked President Theodore Roosevelt to mediate peace, and both sides accepted. Thanks in no small measure to Roosevelt's adroit negotiating, which won him the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize, both sides agreed that Russia would give up any rights to Port Arthur and to the southern half of Sakhalin, an elongated island in Northeast Asia located just off the coast of Russia. However, Russia would not pay any indemnities to Japan. Japan, in turn, could exercise control over Korea. Both countries agreed to evacuate Manchuria. But Japan, who considered herself the victor in the war, left the negotiations embittered and dissatisfied, believing the empire should have received more in the peace agreement. Within this attitude was the general impression that the United States was inappropriately foisting herself into Asia and regional politics with the intent to limit Japan, setting the stage for more contentious politics between the two nations. Japan did not want to become a colony of the United States or anyone else, but they did want to be considered a great power. And the great powers prior to World War II were the more modern Western nations. The tension between what Japan was and what Japan wanted to be heated up during the early reign of Emperor Hirohito and was greatly fueled by Japan's military leader, Tojo. Hirohito was a peaceful man who preferred to settle scores diplomatically. For the most part, he lived a solitary life and avoided the company of people. but despite his personality, his reign presided over the invasion of China, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and eventually the Japanese surrender to the Allies. It is perhaps the passive preferences of the Emperor Hirohito that enabled others, including the military officer Hideki Tojo, to overshadow Hirohito's rule and use militaristic policies that resulted in millions being killed in wars that were meant to expand Japanese influence. Seeking raw materials to fuel its growing industries and ambitions, Japan stages an explosion that destroys a section of their own railway track near the city of Mukden in Manchuria. The Japanese blamed Chinese nationalists for the incident and used the opportunity to retaliate and invade Manchuria. Manchuria quickly fell to Japanese forces, and Japan promptly set up a Manchukyo, or a puppet government, but the calculated efforts of Japan to start the conflict were quickly exposed. The Japanese attack on China was condemned by the United States and many other members of the League of Nations, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and France. They all possess colonies in East and Southeast Asia, and Japan's military power and her willingness to use it threatened the Western economic and territorial interests in Asia. In 1938, the United States began to adopt a succession of increasingly punitive trade restrictions with Japan, including the Export Control Act of 1940, which originated as a presidential proclamation by Roosevelt, and it forbade the exporting of aircraft parts, chemicals, and minerals without a license, and it was intended to induce Japan to curtail its occupation of the coast of Indochina. But Japan was not deterred from continuing her war in China or from signing the Tripartite Pact in 1940 with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Tripartite Pact guaranteed aid and assistance if a member of the pact was attacked by a country not already involved in a conflict with that country. By joining the agreement, Japan gained global power and influence and sent the unmistakable message that any U.S. military intervention risked war on both shores, with Germany and Italy in the Atlantic and with Japan in the Pacific. However, Roosevelt wasn't daunted, believing that the American way of life was at stake should the Far East fall under fascist military dictatorship. Therefore, the United States committed to help the British and the Chinese through loans of money and materials. And in doing so, the United States moved from a neutral country to a nation preparing for war. In September of 1940, Japan moved into Vichy France-controlled French Indochina, further raising tensions. Now Japan was at war with China, had withdrawn from the League of Nations, entered into an alliance with Germany and Italy, and increased her militarization, all of which induced the United States to intensify measures to restrain Japan economically. The U.S. closed the Panama Canal to Japanese shipments, and they placed an embargo on U.S. scrap metal shipments to Japan, actions that hit Japan hard since nearly 75% of her scrap iron came from the U.S. And in mid-1940, Roosevelt moved the United States Pacific Fleet to Hawaii, intending again to deter Japanese Pacific aggressions. In 1940, Tojo, who had been the top commander of the Kwangtung Army during the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, was made Minister of War, and he soon clashed with Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono, who had been fighting for the reform of the Japanese government, namely the demilitarization of its politics. In October, Kono resigned and Tojo succeeded him as Prime Minister. Not only did Tojo keep his offices of Army Minister and War Minister when he became Prime Minister, but he also assumed the offices of Minister of Commerce and Industry. Tojo, now a virtual dictator, quickly promised a new order in Asia. It's July 1941. Japan occupies key airfields in Indochina. Actions followed by an agreement between Japan and Vichy France. In response, the United States froze Japanese assets, and on August the 11th, 1941, the U.S. established a complete embargo on oil and gasoline exports to Japan. Months earlier, Japan had looked south, particularly to Brunei and Malay for oil and rubber, but the requests were met with meager counteroffers. So the oil embargo was particularly tough on the Japanese because oil was her most crucial import, with more than 80% of the island's oil coming from the United States. To improve relations between the United States and Japan, negotiations began the same year, and during these talks, Japan considered withdrawing from most of China and Indochina. They also contemplated an independent interpretation of the Tripartite Pact and would not discriminate in trade if all the other countries reciprocated. But Hideki Tojo rejected any compromise with China. From the Japanese military standpoint, the complete U.S. embargo had reduced Japan to a country with two options. One, seize Southeast Asia before its existing stock of strategic materials were depleted, or two, submit to American demands. Moreover, any southern operation would be vulnerable to attack from the Philippines, which was a U.S. colony. And so, in the Japanese military mind, war against the United States seemed necessary in any case.